Some walls hold up buildings. Others hold up secrets that could destroy everything. The December wind cut through Manhattan's financial district like a blade, but Callum Drake barely felt it through his $1,000 coat. Most nights, he'd slip into his waiting Bentley without a second glance at the world outside his tower. But tonight, something made him walk. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the board meeting that had left 3 families jobless. Or maybe it was the bottle of whiskey he'd emptied while signing the termination papers. The alley between 2 skyscrapers was darker than his conscience. Street lights flickered like dying stars, casting shadows that danced with secrets. That's when he saw her. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, pressed against a brick wall like she was trying to disappear into it. Her body shook, violent tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. Callum stopped. In his world, people either wanted something from him or feared him. Children usually ran. This one didn't even look up. She wasn't begging, wasn't holding a cup or a sign. Her small hands were flat against the wall, like she was listening to something only she could hear. Her lips were blue, not the pale blue of someone who forgot their jacket. The deep, terrifying blue of someone who'd been freezing for hours. Her sweater hung in tatters, threads dangling like broken promises. One sleeve was completely gone, revealing a tiny arm covered in bruises that looked like fingerprints. But it was her position that stopped Callum's heart. She wasn't just against the wall. She was guarding it. Her thin frame spread wide, arms stretched out like a human shield protecting something precious behind her. What could a child possibly be hiding? Callum took a step closer. The sound of his Italian leather shoes on wet concrete echoed like gunshots. The girl's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. "Hey," he called out, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Nothing. Are you okay?" Still nothing. But her trembling got worse. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it over the city's heartbeat. A whimper. Soft and broken. It wasn't coming from the girl. It was coming from behind the wall she was protecting. Callum's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a homeless child seeking shelter. This was something else entirely. Something that would haunt him forever. Because the truth waiting behind that wall would shatter everything he thought he knew about power, protection, and the price some people pay for silence. Callum Drake was used to making billion-dollar decisions in seconds. But standing in that alley, facing a shivering child, he felt powerless for the first time in decades. People didn't say no to Callum Drake. Senators returned his calls. CEOs begged for his approval. Entire industries shifted when he spoke. But here was a 7-year-old girl who wouldn't even acknowledge his existence. Her defiance wasn't bratty or rebellious. It was desperate. The kind of desperation that comes from protecting something more valuable than your own life. "I'm not going to hurt you," Callum whispered, crouching down to her level. The girl's head tilted slightly. She'd heard him. But she didn't move from her position. Callum studied her profile in the dim light. Dirt streaked her face like war paint. Her hair was matted, tangled with secrets. But her eyes, what he could see of them, burned with a fierce determination that reminded him of himself at that age. Before the money, before the power, back when he was just another kid fighting to survive. The whimpering sound came again from behind the wall. Weaker this time. More urgent. "Someone's hurt back there, isn't there?" Callum asked. The girl's tiny hands pressed harder against the brick. Her knuckles were white, scraped raw. Would you have stopped or walked away? Most people would have called the police and disappeared into the night, convincing themselves they'd done their part. But sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when nobody's watching. Callum reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. The girl spun around so fast he barely saw her move. No, her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of pure terror. "No police. Please." Her eyes met his for the first time. They were green like his own, but filled with a pain no child should ever know. Tears had carved clean tracks down her dirty cheeks. "They'll take him away," she choked out. "He's all I have left." Him. The person behind the wall was a he. Stories like this open hearts. If you believe more people should hear them, hit subscribe. Because what Callum found behind that wall would change not just his life, but everything he thought he knew about family, sacrifice, and the lengths people go to protect the ones they love. Sometimes the smallest people carry the heaviest burdens. Nyla. That's what she whispered when Callum promised he wasn't there to hurt her, stood barely 3 feet tall. But when she raised her chin to meet his eyes, she looked like a warrior ready to face an army. "You want something," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Everyone always wants something. Callum felt something crack inside his chest. This child had learned lessons that most adults never face. She'd been betrayed so many times that kindness looked like another trap. "I just want to help," he said. Nyla's laugh was bitter, too bitter for someone who should still believe in fairy tales. "Help costs money we don't have. And when we can't pay." She gestured to her bruised arm. The pieces started clicking together in Callum's mind. Someone had been hurting these kids. Someone who saw them as disposable. "Take me," Nyla said suddenly, stepping away from the wall. "But leave my brother alone. He didn't do anything wrong." The words hit Callum like a physical blow. She thought he was one of them. A predator. A monster who preyed on children with nowhere to run. "God, no," he whispered, raising his hands. "I'm not. I would never." But why should she believe him? To her, he was just another man in an expensive suit who'd found them in their hiding place. Another threat in a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. "You don't understand," Nyla continued, her small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Malik gets sick easy. He cries when strangers touch him. You don't want him anyway." Malik. The brother she was protecting. Callum's heart shattered completely. This little girl was offering herself as sacrifice to save a sibling she loved more than her own safety. She was ready to walk into hell if it meant keeping her brother safe. "How old are you?" Callum asked gently. 7. Almost 8. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "Old enough." Old enough for what? The question hung in the air like poison. "And your brother?" 3. Still little. Still innocent. Her voice broke on the last word, and Callum realized she didn't consider herself innocent anymore. Life had stolen that from her. "Nyla, I'm not here to take anyone anywhere. I saw you shivering, and I was worried." She studied his face like she was reading a book written in a language she didn't trust. Looking for lies. For hidden meanings. For the catch that always came. "People like you don't worry about people like us," she whispered. And maybe she was right. Maybe people like him had created the world that left children like her with no choice but to become shields for the ones they loved. Most people don't know this, but it changes everything when you realize that love can make a 3-year-old wiser than any adult in a boardroom. A tiny face appeared from behind the wall. Round cheeks. Eyes too big for his head. A thumb stuck firmly in his mouth like it was the only safe thing left in the world. Malik. He was so small that Callum wondered how he'd survived this long on the streets. His clothes hung off his tiny frame like he was playing dress-up in someone else's nightmare. But it was his eyes that broke something fundamental in Callum's soul. They held the same fierce intelligence as his sisters, but without the hardened edges. He still looked at the world like it might surprise him with something good. "Nyla," Malik whispered around his thumb. "Cold." "I know, baby. I know." Nyla reached back and pulled him closer, wrapping her torn sweater around both of them. It was nowhere near enough, but it was all she had. The boy's legs were unsteady. He leaned heavily against his sister, and Callum could see the exhaustion in every line of his tiny body. This wasn't just cold and hunger. This was a child whose body was giving up. "How long have you been out here?" Callum asked. Nyla's jaw tightened. "Long enough to learn that help always comes with a price." Malik coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Callum's medical instincts kick in. He'd heard that cough before, in the children's hospital his foundation funded. Pneumonia. Maybe worse. He needs a doctor, Callum said. Doctors ask questions. Questions lead to answers. Answers lead to them taking us away from each other. Nyla's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. She'd thought this through. What if they could help him get better? And then what? Nyla's green eyes blazed. They split us up? Send him to one family, me to another? Make him forget I exist? Malik tugged on his sister's sleeve. Hungry Nyla. I know, baby. Maybe tomorrow we'll find something. Tomorrow. Like it was a promise she could keep. Like there would definitely be a tomorrow for both of them. Callum watched this little girl carry the weight of the world on shoulders that should have been worried about homework and playground games. She was the mother, the protector, the provider, everything this little boy had left. And she was losing the fight. They called Callum Drake the Destroyer. Not to his face, of course. People valued their careers too much for that kind of honesty. But in boardrooms across 3 continents, the whisper followed him like a shadow. Drake doesn't just beat you. He erases you. He'd built Titan Industries from nothing, turning a single software patent into a $40 billion empire. Along the way, he'd crushed competitors like insects, absorbed smaller companies before they knew they were prey, and fired thousands of employees with the cold efficiency of a machine. The business world respected him. They also feared him. Wall Street analysts called his methods aggressively innovative. His former partners called them something else entirely. Callum preferred to think of himself as practical. Emotion was weakness. Sentiment was expensive. Mercy was for people who couldn't afford to win. He'd learned that lesson early, growing up in Detroit's worst neighborhoods. His mother worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on. His father disappeared when the bills got too high. By 12, Callum knew that survival meant being harder, smarter, and more ruthless than everyone else. So he became all 3. His first kill was Gentle, a small tech startup that was developing software similar to his own. He bought them out, fired the entire team, and buried their innovation in patent hell. The founder called him, crying, begging for his employees' jobs back. Callum hung up and blocked the number. The second was easier. A manufacturing company in Ohio that owed him money. When they couldn't pay, he foreclosed on their factory, sold their equipment, and watched 3 generations of workers clean out their lockers. The local news ran a story about families losing their homes. Callum bought the station 6 months later. By 30, he was worth his first billion. By 35, he'd forgotten how to feel guilty about it. His penthouse apartment was a museum of his victories. Signed contracts worth hundreds of millions. Awards from organizations grateful for his philanthropic contributions. Photos with presidents and prime ministers who needed his support more than he needed theirs. He slept alone in a bed that cost more than most people's houses, surrounded by the silence that money could buy. So why was he frozen in an alley, staring at 2 homeless children who had nothing to offer him? Why did watching Nyla wrap her brother in that pathetic excuse for a sweater feel like watching his own heart break? Why did Malik's trusting eyes remind him of someone he'd tried so hard to forget? The 12-year-old boy who used to believe that people were basically good, that the world would reward kindness, that love was stronger than greed. That boy had died in a boardroom 23 years ago, sacrificed on the altar of ambition and success. But standing here, watching Nyla count out pieces of stale bread like they were gold coins, Callum felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Shame. Deep, crushing shame for every choice that had brought him power at someone else's expense. The truth always comes out in fragments, like broken glass catching light. Nyla's story emerged piece by piece, each word carefully weighed before she spoke it. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but Malik's cough was getting worse, and desperation makes people take chances they normally wouldn't. Mama worked 2 jobs, she began, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Callum's shoulder. Cleaning offices at night, serving breakfast in the morning. Never saw her sleep, but she always made sure we ate. Callum stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement would make her stop talking. She had dreams, you know? Wanted to go back to school, become a nurse. Said she was going to save up enough money to get us a real house, with a yard where Malik could play. Nyla's voice got quieter. She was saving every penny. The past tense hung in the air like smoke. What happened to her? Callum asked gently. Nyla's hand found Malik's hair, stroking it like a talisman against bad memories. Heart attack. Right there in the diner kitchen. 28 years old. And her heart just stopped. 28. Callum spent more than that on lunch some days. The funeral home wanted $3,000 before they'd even talk to us. Social services showed up at the apartment with papers and clipboards, talking about proper placement and suitable environments. Nyla's voice took on a mocking tone that sounded wrong coming from someone so young. They split us up the first night. Put me in one house, Malik in another. I could hear him crying through the phone when his new family let me call. He kept asking when I was coming to get him. Callum felt something cold settle in his stomach. So you ran. 3 times. Every time they found us, the punishments got worse. Foster families don't like kids who cause trouble. She rolled up her sleeve, showing him a scar that looked suspiciously like a cigarette burn. The 3rd family had very clear rules about obedience. Rage flooded through Callum's system. Pure, white-hot fury at adults who would hurt children for the crime of loving each other. The last time we ran, I heard them talking on the phone with social services. Nyla's voice dropped to a whisper. 2 black kids with no paperwork aren't worth the trouble. That's what the woman said. They were going to send Malik to a group home 3 states away and me to another family who specifically wanted an older girl for different reasons. The implication hit Callum like a physical blow. So we disappeared. Been on our own for 4 months now. Living in abandoned buildings, eating from dumpsters, avoiding anyone who looks official. She lifted her chin again, that familiar defiance blazing in her eyes. But we're together, and nobody's going to change that. Nobody except pneumonia, starvation, or the next predator who found them alone and defenseless. Nyla, Callum said carefully, what if there was another way? Sometimes the ghosts of our past show up wearing the faces of children we barely know. Callum stared at Nyla's defiant green eyes and saw himself at 9 years old, standing in a welfare office that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. His mother had been dead for 3 days. Cancer, they said, though he knew it was really poverty that killed her, the kind that makes you choose between medicine and rent until your body gives up the fight. The social worker had kind eyes and cruel policies. She explained how the system worked using words like placement and adjustment period that made him feel like furniture being moved to storage. We'll find you a good home, she promised, the same lie probably echoing in offices across the country that very moment. But good homes were for kids with clean backgrounds and quiet trauma. Callum was angry, loud, and had already been caught stealing food twice. The kind of kid who got shuffled from house to house until he aged out or disappeared entirely. He would have vanished into the system's dark corners if his uncle hadn't shown up, a man who barely knew him but recognized something familiar in his fury. Someone who understood that sometimes love means taking a chance on a kid everyone else has written off. Uncle Marcus wasn't rich, wasn't powerful. He was a mechanic who worked double shifts and ate ramen for dinner so Callum could have real food. He never asked for gratitude or promises, just gave a broken boy a place to heal and the tools to build something better. That man saved his life, changed everything, turned a street kid heading for juvenile detention into someone who could dream bigger than his circumstances. So why was he about to walk away now? Why was Callum Drake, who owed everything to one person's unexpected kindness, standing in this alley calculating the risks of helping two children who needed exactly what he needed at their age. The answer tasted like shame in his mouth. Because helping them would be complicated, messy. It would require phone calls and paperwork and explanations to people who wouldn't understand why a billionaire CEO was suddenly playing savior to homeless kids. It would cost him time, energy, and peace of mind. 3 things that money couldn't buy back once they were spent. But as Malik's cough echoed off the alley walls and Nyla pulled her brother closer with hands that shouldn't know how to be a mother, Callum felt his uncle's voice cutting through decades of carefully constructed selfishness. Some kids just need someone to see them as worth saving. Marcus had seen that worth in an angry 9-year-old who trusted no one. Now Callum was looking at 2 children who'd lost everything except each other. And the question wasn't whether they deserved help. The question was whether he deserved the chance to give it. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic music and villain monologues. Sometimes it just drives slowly down dark alleys in unmarked vans. The sound of the engine was wrong, too quiet, too deliberate. Callum's head snapped up as headlights swept across the alley entrance, moving like a predator stalking prey. Nyla heard it too. Her entire body went rigid, and she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, pulling Malik behind her with movements that spoke of practiced terror. "Get down," she whispered to Callum, her voice barely audible. "Don't let them see you." The van stopped at the mouth of the alley, engine still running, waiting. 2 men climbed out, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They weren't cops. Cops would have announced themselves, used flashlights, followed protocols. These men moved like hunters who knew exactly what they were looking for. The first one was massive, built like a linebacker with hands that looked capable of breaking bones without effort. His partner was smaller, wiry, with the kind of smile that made decent people cross the street. "I know they're here," the big one said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Got a tip from someone who saw them begging near the subway station." "Fresh meat," the smaller one replied, lighting a cigarette. "Girl's the right age. Boy might be too young now, but give him a year or 2. Callum's blood turned to ice water. He'd heard rumors in his business circles, whispered conversations about supply chains that dealt in human cargo. He'd always assumed it was urban legend, the kind of story people told to feel better about their own moral compromises. But here it was, real and hunting in his city. "Check behind the dumpsters," big guy instructed. "If they're smart, they'll be hidden somewhere they can run if they need to." The men started walking into the alley, flashlights cutting through the darkness like surgical instruments. Nyla's breathing became shallow, panicked. She was calculating distances, escape routes, survival odds. All the mental math a 7-year-old should never have to learn. Malik sensed the danger even if he didn't understand it. He buried his face in his sister's shoulder, making himself as small as possible. 20 feet away. 15. 10. Callum had seconds to decide. He could stay hidden, let the men search, hope they missed the children in the shadows, keep himself safe and uninvolved, maintain the distance between his world and theirs. Or he could do something that would change everything. The beam of the flashlight swept closer to where Nyla and Malik were hiding. 5 more seconds and the men would see them. 3 seconds. 2. Callum stepped out of the shadows. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" His voice cut through the night like a blade, calm and commanding. The voice that had closed billion-dollar deals and fired executives without flinching. But his heart was hammering against his ribs like a cage bird, because he'd just painted a target on his back for 2 children he barely knew. Power is a funny thing. Most people think it comes from money or position or the ability to hurt others. But real power, the kind that changes everything, comes from being willing to stand up when standing up costs you something precious. The 2 men froze when Callum stepped into their flashlight beams. They'd expected to find homeless children, not a man in a $3,000 coat who spoke like he owned the world. "Wrong, alley buddy," the big one said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Keep walking." Callum smiled. The same smile he used in boardrooms when someone tried to intimidate him. Cold, sharp, utterly fearless. Actually, I think you're the ones in the wrong place. The smaller man flicked his cigarette away and studied Callum more carefully, taking in the expensive clothes, the confident posture, the way he stood like someone accustomed to being obeyed. You don't want to get involved in this, Cigarette Man said. Trust me. You're right, Callum replied, pulling out his phone. I don't want to be involved. But here we are. He held up the device, making sure they could see the screen. 911. One button. I wonder how fast the police respond in this neighborhood when someone with my address calls them. The men exchanged looks. They were street predators, used to hunting victims who couldn't fight back. But Callum wasn't a victim. He was something more dangerous, a man with resources and the willingness to use them. This isn't over, Big Guy growled, but he was already backing toward the van. Actually, it is, Callum said. Because if I see either of you in this neighborhood again, I'll make sure you become very famous. The kind of famous that makes life extremely difficult. They climbed back into their van and drove away, but not before the smaller man rolled down his window. You made a mistake tonight, rich boy. We don't forget faces. The van disappeared into the night, taking its predatory hunger with it. But the threat lingered in the air like poison. Callum turned back toward the shadows where Nyla and Malik were hiding. The little girl emerged slowly, her eyes wide with something between gratitude and suspicion. Why did you do that? She whispered. Before he could answer, she leaned closer to her brother and added something that cut straight through his heart. Don't trust him, Malik. They always come back. And when they do, he won't be here to save us. The words hit him like a physical blow. Because she was right. Those men would return with reinforcements, angrier and more dangerous than before. And Callum had just made 2 children targets in a war they couldn't win alone. Some mysteries reveal themselves slowly, like dawn breaking over a city. Others hit you like lightning, illuminating terrible truths you wish you'd never seen. Callum couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Nyla's face when those men approached. The way she'd positioned herself between danger and her brother without a moment's hesitation. The way she'd accepted that no adult would actually protect them when it mattered. By 3 a.m, he was in his home office, fingers flying across his keyboard. He had resources most people couldn't imagine. Government databases that owed him favors. Private investigators who never asked questions. Technology that could find anyone who existed in the digital world. But Nyla and Malik seemed to exist nowhere at all. No birth certificates in any state database. No school records. No medical files. No social security numbers. No immigration documents. It was like they'd been erased from existence before they were ever born. Callum expanded his search, pulling strings he rarely used. Hospital records from the past 8 years. Morgue reports. Missing persons databases. Adoption agencies. Still nothing. He tried their mother's name, the woman who'd worked 2 jobs and dreamed of becoming a nurse. Searched every variation he could think of, cross-referenced with employment records from diners and cleaning services across the tri-state area. The absence of information was more disturbing than any criminal record would have been. People left traces. Everyone left traces. Unless someone worked very hard to make sure they didn't. At 4:30, his private investigator called back. Boss, I've been searching all night. Found something weird, though. There's a gap in the system around those kids' ages and description. Like someone scrubbed the records clean. What kind of gap? The kind that costs serious money to create. We're talking about someone with access to federal databases, state systems, maybe even international networks. This isn't just lost paperwork. This is intentional erasure. Callum's stomach dropped. Who has that kind of reach? Government agencies. Organized crime. Very wealthy individuals with very specific reasons to make people disappear from official records. The pieces started forming a picture that made Callum's blood run cold. Why didn't they exist on paper? The answer would shock him. Because Nyla and Malik weren't just homeless children failed by the system. They were something much more dangerous to someone much more powerful. They were evidence. Living proof of something that someone had paid millions to hide. Something worth killing children to protect. And Callum had just put himself between two kids and whoever had enough power to erase them from existence itself. The truth has a way of finding you when you're least prepared to face it. At 6 a.m, Callum's assistant Yvette called with the information he'd requested. Her voice was strained, like she'd been crying. "Sir, I found the records you wanted. But you're not going to like what I discovered." Callum poured himself coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "Tell me." The children's mother, her name was Zara Johnson. She worked for Pinnacle Cleaning Services. The name hit him like ice water. Pinnacle was one of his subsidiaries, acquired 3 years ago in a hostile takeover that had made the financial headlines. She was employed there for 2 years, Yvette continued. Worked the night shift cleaning office buildings downtown. No health insurance. No benefits. Classified as an independent contractor to avoid paying workers' compensation. Callum's stomach twisted. He knew the classification game. It saved companies millions, while leaving workers completely vulnerable. There's more, sir. Last year, Pinnacle received multiple complaints about working conditions. Employees using dangerous chemicals without proper ventilation. Safety equipment that hadn't been updated in decades. Workers collapsing on the job. What did we do about it? The silence stretched too long. We buried the complaints in legal paperwork and fired the employees who spoke up, including Zara Johnson. The coffee cup slipped from Callum's fingers, shattering against his marble floor. She lost her apartment 2 weeks after termination, Yvette continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Moved to a condemned building with her children. That's where she had the heart attack. Alone, with no money for medical care, surrounded by the toxic mold that building was condemned for. Callum's legs gave out. He sank into his chair as the full weight of the revelation crushed him. He hadn't just failed to help those children. He was the reason they needed help. His company had killed their mother as surely as if he'd poisoned her himself. His policies, his cost-cutting measures, his relentless pursuit of profit over people. It had all led to a 28-year-old woman dying on a dirty floor while her babies slept in the next room. The records were scrubbed because of a lawsuit potential, Yvette added quietly. Legal decided it was cheaper to erase their existence than deal with wrongful death claims. Nyla and Malik didn't exist on paper because Callum's lawyers had made them disappear. Sir, are you still there? Callum couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The empire he'd built, the success he'd celebrated, the ruthless efficiency he'd been so proud of, it was all covered in the blood of innocent people. How many other Zaras had died for his quarterly profits? How many other children were sleeping in alleys because his companies had prioritized shareholders over human lives? If this happened in your city, wouldn't you want to know first? Subscribe now. Because this wasn't just one story. This was happening everywhere, hidden behind corporate lawyers and scrubbed databases, while men in expensive suits counted money earned on the backs of people too poor to fight back. And Callum Drake had been the worst of them all. There are moments when a man sees himself clearly for the first time, and the reflection is so ugly it breaks something fundamental inside him. Callum sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by awards and accolades that suddenly looked like tombstones. Each one represented lives destroyed, families torn apart, dreams crushed under the weight of his ambition. The Businessman of the Year trophy mocked him from its place on the mahogany shelf. The magazine had called him a visionary leader who maximizes efficiency and shareholder value. They'd never mentioned Zara Johnson, dying alone while her children slept 20 feet away. For the first time in his adult life, Callum Drake cried. Not the strategic tears he'd used in boardrooms to manipulate sympathy. Not the calculated emotion he displayed at charity galas to win public favor. These were raw, ugly sobs that came from a place he'd thought he'd buried decades ago. He thought about Nyla, spitting defiance while her brother coughed up blood. She'd called him a monster, and she'd been right. Not because of what he'd done to her directly, but because of the machine he'd built that ground up people like her mother, without a second thought. He remembered Malik's trusting eyes, the way the little boy had looked at him like he might actually be someone worth believing in. What would those eyes look like when the child learned the truth? When he discovered that the man offering help was the same one who'd taken everything away. Callum picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Senators, governors, CEOs, judges, an entire network of powerful people who owed him favors, who would move mountains with a single phone call. But none of them could bring back a dead mother. None of them could give 2 children back their innocence, their safety, their belief that the world was fundamentally good. His uncle's voice echoed in his memory. Some kids just need someone to see them as worth saving. Marcus had saved him when he was broken and angry and headed for a life of crime. Had given him opportunity, education, the tools to build something better than the poverty he'd been born into. Instead, Callum had built something worse. A machine that created poverty, that fed on desperation, that turned human suffering into shareholder dividends. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to honor the man who'd believed in him. Maybe he could still choose to be someone worth that belief. Maybe he could start by saving 2 children whose lives he'd already destroyed once. It wouldn't erase what he'd done. Nothing could do that. But it might, if he was very lucky, begin to balance the scales. Redemption is a lot harder than destruction. You can tear down a life in minutes, but rebuilding trust takes miracles. Callum returned to the alley at sunset, his Bentley loaded with supplies. Blankets thick enough to block the winter wind. Food that didn't come from dumpsters. Medicine for Malik's cough. Clothes that actually fit. He found them in the same spot, pressed against the wall like they were part of the brick itself. But something had changed. Nyla's eyes held a new kind of wariness, the look of someone who'd learned to recognize danger in expensive packages. "Go away," she said before he could speak. "I brought food. Medicine for your brother. We don't want your help." But her eyes lingered on the bag of groceries, and Callum could hear her stomach growling from 5 feet away. He knelt down and started unpacking anyway. Sandwiches from the deli near his office. Juice boxes. Children's cough medicine. A stuffed animal he'd grabbed impulsively, thinking it might comfort Malik. "I said go away." Nyla's voice cracked with exhaustion and fury. That's when she spat at him. Not a child's petulant gesture, but the calculated insult of someone who'd learned that saliva was sometimes the only weapon you had. The spit hit his cheek and ran down like a tear. Callum didn't wipe it away. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he said quietly. "I know I'm just another stranger making promises I might not keep. You're worse than a stranger." Nyla's green eyes blazed with an anger too old for her face. "You're like all the rest. You see poor kids and think helping makes you feel better about yourself." She was right, and they both knew it. But then Malik started coughing again, deep, wet sounds that made Callum think of drowning. The little boy's lips were turning blue. His tiny body convulsed with each cough, like his lungs were trying to escape his chest. Nyla's anger cracked. For just a moment, she looked like what she was, a terrified 7-year-old watching her baby brother die by inches. "The medicine," Callum said gently, holding up the bottle. "Please. Just for him." Nyla stared at the medicine like it was both salvation and trap. Her brother needed it, but accepting it meant owing something to a man she couldn't trust. Finally, she snatched the bottle from his hands. "This doesn't mean anything," she whispered as she measured out the dose. "We're still not going with you." But as Malik's coughing finally quieted and the little boy's breathing eased, something shifted in the air between them. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the first fragile seed of possibility. Sometimes the hardest part of accepting help is believing you deserve it. The safe house was a brownstone in Brooklyn that didn't appear on any official records. Callum had bought it years ago through shell companies, originally planning to use it for corporate espionage that never materialized. Now it served a different purpose entirely. Dr. Rivera arrived within an hour, a woman who'd learned to ask no questions and keep no records. She'd treated everyone from whistleblowers to abuse victims, people who couldn't afford to exist in the official healthcare system. Pneumonia, she confirmed after examining Malik. Early stages, but it would have been fatal within days without treatment. The little boy looked impossibly small in the queen-sized bed, connected to and for that pumped antibiotics into his tiny system. But his breathing was already easier, his color better. Nyla hadn't left his side for 6 hours. She sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, one small hand resting on her brother's arm, like she could transfer her own strength to him through touch. "He's going to be okay," Dr. Rivera assured her. "But he needs rest, good food, and a warm place to recover." Nyla nodded, but didn't relax. Her eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits, measuring distances, calculating how fast she could grab Malik and run if this turned out to be another trap. Callum had stocked the house with everything they might need. Clothes in their sizes, toys appropriate for their ages, books, art supplies, a kitchen full of food that didn't require fighting other desperate people to obtain. But luxury couldn't buy trust. "Why are you doing this?" Nyla asked when Dr. Rivera left. It was the first full sentence she'd spoken to him since they'd arrived. Callum sat in the chair across from her, far enough away that she wouldn't feel cornered. "Because you need help. People like you don't help people like us. Not without wanting something back." She was right to be suspicious. In her experience, every kindness came with strings attached. Every helping hand eventually became a fist. "Maybe I'm trying to be different than I used to be," Callum said. Nyla's laugh was bitter. "People don't change. They just get better at pretending." "You might be right, but what if you're wrong?" She studied his face like she was reading a map to find the lies hidden in his expression, looking for the tells that would reveal his real motives. "My mama used to say that," she whispered finally. "What if you're wrong?" She said it when I told her rich people didn't care about us. Said maybe somewhere there was a good one who would prove me wrong. Her voice broke on the last words. But then she died cleaning their offices for money that wasn't enough to keep us alive. So I guess I was right after all. Callum felt the weight of that truth settle in his chest like lead. Because somewhere in some office building his company owned, Zara Johnson had collapsed while making him richer. And her daughter was sitting here now, walls higher than skyscrapers, waiting for him to prove that good people were just fairy tales after all. Hope is the cruelest gift you can give someone who's learned not to believe in it. 3 weeks into their stay at the safe house, Malik was strong enough to run around the small backyard, chasing butterflies and laughing like he'd forgotten what fear sounded like. His cough was gone, his cheeks had color, and he'd started calling Callum Mr. Cal, with the easy trust that only children possess. Nyla watched her brother's transformation with complicated emotions. Relief warred with suspicion. Gratitude battled with the certainty that this happiness was temporary. "I want to talk to you about school," Callum said one morning over breakfast. Nyla's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "School. Both of you. There's a good private academy nearby. Small classes, excellent teachers. They've agreed to take you without the usual paperwork requirements." "Why?" The question came out sharp, defensive. "Because children should learn. Because you're both brilliant and deserve the chance to prove it." Nyla set down her fork entirely. "And when this ends, when you get bored of playing savior, what happens to us then?" The question hit harder than she'd probably intended. Because it was the same one keeping Callum awake at 3 in the morning, staring at his ceiling and wondering what the hell he was doing. "This isn't temporary," he said carefully. "Everything's temporary when you're like us." Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was explaining basic math. "Rich people get tired of their charity cases. We've seen it before. I'm not going anywhere, Nyla. That's what they all say. But she was looking at Malik, who was coloring in a book with intense concentration, tongue poking out in focus. But he needs to learn to read properly and count past 20. Would you have trusted him if you were Nyla? A 7-year-old who'd been betrayed by every adult who was supposed to protect her, watching a billionaire promise stability, while knowing that promises were just words that people used before they disappeared. 1 semester, she said finally. If you're still here after that, we'll talk about the next one. Fair enough. And if you leave, I want enough money to take care of us both. Real money, not charity scraps. The negotiation of a child who'd been forced to think like an adult, planning for abandonment even as she accepted help. Deal, Callum said, though the word tasted like ashes in his mouth, because he was already planning forever, while she was just trying to survive the next few months. The truth has perfect timing. It always arrives at the worst possible moment. 2 months later, on a Thursday night when rain hammered against the safe house windows, Nyla couldn't sleep. Malik had been having nightmares again, small whimpers that made her want to crawl into bed with him like she used to when they lived in the abandoned building. She crept downstairs for water and heard voices from Callum's study. The door was slightly open, spilling light into the dark hallway. Can't keep hiding this from her forever, Yvette was saying. She's 8 years old. She doesn't need to know the details. She's going to find out eventually. Kids aren't stupid, especially not that one. She already suspects something. Nyla pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. They were talking about her. The legal team says the records are sealed permanently, Callum replied. There's no way for her to trace it back. And if she does? What happens when she discovers that Pinnacle Cleaning was yours? That you're the reason her mother lost her job, lost her apartment, lost her life? The words hit Nyla like physical blows. Each revelation was a knife twisting deeper into her chest. Callum, Mr. Cal, who brought them toys and promised them safety, was the monster who'd killed her mama. She'll hate me, Callum said quietly. But maybe that's what I deserve. And the children? What happens to them when she puts the pieces together? I don't know. But I can't undo what I did. All I can do is try to make it right. By lying to them. By protecting them. By giving them the life their mother should have been able to provide. Nyla's legs gave out. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, tears streaming down her face in silent rivers. The man who'd saved them was the same one who'd destroyed them. The person she'd started just barely started. To trust was the enemy who'd taken everything away. Her mama had died because of him. Died cleaning his buildings for wages that weren't enough to live on, without health insurance, without safety equipment, without anyone who cared whether she came home at night. And then he'd had the lawyers erase them from existence, so he wouldn't have to pay for what he'd done. The kindness, the safe house, the promises of school and stability. It was all guilt money. Blood money. The price he was willing to pay to make himself feel better about being a killer. Nyla wiped her eyes and stood up on shaking legs. She had to get Malik out of here. Had to run before this man decided that keeping them quiet permanently was cheaper than keeping them comfortable. She tiptoed back upstairs and started packing their few belongings in the darkness. They'd survived on the streets before. They could do it again. Because anything was better than living on the charity of the man who'd murdered their mother. Sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is tell the truth when a lie would save them from losing everything they care about. Callum found Nyla at the front door at 3 a.m, Malik sleeping in her arms, and a backpack full of their belongings slung over her thin shoulder. Going somewhere? He asked quietly. She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes cut straight through his soul. Pure hatred mixed with betrayal, so deep it had no bottom. I know, she whispered. I know what you did. The words hung between them like a death sentence. All the carefully constructed hope, the fragile trust they'd been building, it crumbled to ash in the space of a heartbeat. Nyla, don't. Her voice shook with rage. Don't lie to me anymore. I heard you talking to Yvette. About Pinnacle Cleaning. About the lawyers. About erasing us. Callum felt something die inside his chest. The last piece of the boy who'd believed in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that good people could rise from the ashes of their worst mistakes. You killed her, Nyla continued, tears streaming down her face. My mama died because you cared more about money than people. And then you made us disappear so you wouldn't have to pay. Yes. The word came out like broken glass. Yes, I did all of that. She'd been expecting denials, excuses, the kind of adult lies that turn children's pain into unfortunate misunderstandings. His honesty stopped her cold. I killed your mother, Callum continued, his voice breaking. Not with my own hands, but with my policies, my greed, my complete disregard for human life. I destroyed your family, erased your existence, and left you to die on the streets. Malik stirred in her arms, but didn't wake. Even in sleep, he trusted his sister to keep him safe. I was a monster, Callum whispered. Maybe I still am. I spent 20 years building an empire on other people's suffering, and your mother was just one victim in a sea of blood I was too arrogant to see. Then why? Nyla's voice cracked. Why save us now? Because I saw you protecting him in that alley, and I remembered what love looks like. Real love. The kind that sacrifices everything for someone else's safety. I hadn't felt that in so long I'd forgotten it existed. He knelt down to her level, making himself small and vulnerable. I can't bring her back. I can't undo the evil I've done. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to honor her memory by protecting the children she died loving. You expect me to believe you changed? Just like that? No. Callum's voice was steady now, certain. I expect you to watch me prove it. Day after day, year after year, until you decide whether the man I'm trying to become is worth the one I used to be. And if I never forgive you, then you never forgive me. But I still keep my promise to her. I still make sure you and Malik have everything she wanted to give you. Forgiveness isn't a light switch you flip from off to on. It's a slow sunrise that takes its own time to break through the darkness. Nyla stood in that doorway for 10 minutes, Malik growing heavier in her arms while she wrestled with impossible choices. She could walk out that door and return to a life of hunger, cold, and constant fear. Or she could stay with the man who destroyed everything, betting her brother's life on the hope that monsters could change. I don't forgive you, she said finally. I know. I might never forgive you. I understand. And I don't trust you. Not even a little bit. Callum nodded. You shouldn't. Trust has to be earned, and I've got 20 years of earning to do. Then why should we stay? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of two children's futures. Because your mama loved you enough to work herself to death trying to give you a better life. And because I hope, she'd want someone to finish what she started. Nyla's breath hitched. Nobody had talked about her mama like that since she died. Like she was a person who mattered. Like her dreams had value even though poverty had killed them. She wanted to be a nurse, Nyla whispered. I know. Yvette found her college applications. She was 3 classes away from qualifying for the program when she died. 3 classes. 3 classes between cleaning offices at night and saving lives during the day. Between minimum wage and dignity. Between survival and hope. If I stay for her. Not for you. That's enough. And if you hurt us again, if you lie to us or try to send us away, or decide we're too much trouble, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are. The threat came from an 8-year-old girl who weighed less than most adult backpacks. But Callum had seen her defy human traffickers and negotiate with billionaires. He had no doubt she could destroy him if she chose to. Fair enough. Nyla adjusted Malik's weight in her arms and looked back toward the stairs that led to their bedrooms. Safe beds with clean sheets and a little boy's drawings taped to the walls. One day at a time, she said. "One day at a time," Callum agreed. She walked past him toward the stairs, then paused. Her name was Zara. When you think about making this right, remember her name was Zara. And she was the best person in the world. "Zara," Callum repeated softly. "I'll remember." Because some names are too important to ever forget. Redemption doesn't come with applause. It comes with hard choices, long nights, and the kind of sacrifices that never make headlines. Until one day, they do. 6 months after that rainy night, Callum stood on a stage in downtown Brooklyn. Behind him was a banner with a name printed in bold letters: the Zara Johnson Foundation. The crowd was full of children, teachers, and social workers. There were cameras too, hungry for a story, waiting to see if this billionaire's sudden generosity was real or just another PR stunt. Callum adjusted the microphone, his hand trembling. "This foundation," he began, "is not about me. It's about a woman who should still be here today. A woman who worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her children, only to be failed by a system that valued profit over people. Her name was Zara Johnson. And today, we begin honoring her the way the world should have honored her while she was alive." Behind the stage, Nyla sat stiffly in a chair, holding Malik's hand. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't running either. For her, that was progress. The foundation's mission was simple but bold: fund safe homes for children in crisis. Places like the Brownstone Safe House, where Nyla and Malik had first found shelter. Places where no child would ever again have to sleep in alleys, abandoned buildings, or cars while waiting for adults to notice their suffering. The first home would open in a month, just blocks away from where Zara had collapsed and died. Callum had bought the building outright and renovated it from top to bottom. It would bear her name on the front door. When he announced this, a hush fell over the crowd. It wasn't the flashy charity gala most people expected from a billionaire. There were no celebrities, no champagne toasts. Just a quiet promise carved into brick and mortar. After the speech, reporters shouted questions. "Is this redemption? Is this guilt? Is this your way of silencing critics?" Callum looked at Nyla, who was staring at him with eyes too old for her small face. And for the first time, he didn't answer to the press. He answered to her. "It's not about redemption," he said slowly. "It's about responsibility. I can't undo what I've done, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure children like Zara's will never be abandoned again." Some people clapped. Some crossed their arms, skeptical. Others whispered, weighing his words against his reputation. Because in a world addicted to judgment, it's hard to tell whether a man's change of heart is genuine or just another mask. Some call it redemption. Others call it guilt. What do you think? The question hung in the air like smoke. Had Callum really changed? Weeks after the foundation's launch, reporters crowded the steps of his office building. Flashbulbs popped. Microphones shoved forward. Everyone wanted the same thing, an explanation. Why had a man once known for ruthless deals and broken lives suddenly turned his fortune toward children who had nothing? Callum didn't hide this time. He stood in front of them, no script, no advisors whispering in his ear. Just a man with lines on his face that hadn't been there before, wearing a suit that looked more like armor than luxury. "Mr. Hayes," one reporter shouted. "Why the sudden transformation? Why now?" Another cut in. "Is this just guilt money? Or are you trying to fix your image for investors?" The crowd laughed sharply, ready to tear him down again. But Callum raised a hand, and the noise dimmed. His voice was steady. "You want to know why I changed?" He paused, his gaze drifting past the cameras, past the headlines that would twist his words, until they landed on Nyla, standing a few feet behind the crowd, her arms crossed, watching silently. "A little girl shivering against a wall," he said, "taught me more about courage than any boardroom ever could." The reporters froze. The words cut through the chaos like glass breaking. She didn't beg me for help. She didn't even look at me like I was someone to be trusted. She looked at me like I was the enemy. And she was right. I was the enemy. But that little girl, she survived a storm I wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in. She showed me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that builds empires. The kind that keeps a child alive when the world doesn't care. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to keep rolling. Behind the wall of press, Nyla's eyes softened, just a little. For months, she had carried the weight of doubt, suspicion, and a wound too deep for any billionaire's foundation to heal. But hearing those words, spoken in front of the world, was something she never expected. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an apology. It was truth. And truth, no matter how late, had its own kind of power. The reporters, hungry for headlines, broke the silence again. So what happens now, Mr. Hayes? Callum didn't flinch. Now, he said, I keep building. Not companies. Not wealth. But safety. Homes. Futures. For kids like her. For kids like all the ones we ignore until it's too late. The microphones were shoved closer, but the sound of shutters and shouting no longer mattered. Because for the first time, Callum Hayes wasn't talking to the world. He was talking to Nyla. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally listening. If you were Nyla, would you have trusted him or walked away? Tell us in the comments.